Hello, everyone, and welcome to Heads Up, the weekly webcast and podcast of the National Headache Foundation. I'm Dr. Lindsay Weitzel, founder of the Facebook group Migraine Nation, chronic daily migraine survivor, and migraine strategist. I am here today to talk to you about the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is part of a three-part series. Last episode, we discussed FMLA. Today, we're talking about ADA, and in our next episode, we are going to discuss SSDI, or the process of actually applying for disability. So if you're listening to this and you really need this information, you are probably in a lot of pain and you might want to get a pencil. There's going to be a lot of information. Many of us with chronic migraine or chronic cluster or other debilitating headache conditions may find ourselves in a place where we cannot work sometimes. And that is what these episodes are about. We may believe that there are not accommodations available to us, and we are here to tell you that there are, how to utilize these accommodations, and we're lucky to have someone who can walk us through the process. We are here today with Tom Dabertin. Hi, Tom, how are you?
Fine, how are you? Pleasure to be with you again.
I am great, thank you for being here. Tom is the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the National Headache Foundation. He has also worked in depth with the Family Medical Leave Act and these topics that we are discussing in this series. So listen close, because this is a great place to get this information. If you just go online and Google it, you may find some biased information, may be hard to rummage through. I have been there. Your head hurts when you find yourself in this place. So let's get this information to you. So Tom, let's start. What is the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Well, the Americans with Disabilities Act was a act of Congress passed in 1990 that basically did a couple of things. One, for those who have chronic disability, physical disabilities, for example, it was a great relief to them because it provided access and accommodation. But it really is an amazing act because it provides rights to people who don't even realize that they have rights. And let me give you an example. I, for example, can walk and move my arms freely today, but who knows what could happen to me tomorrow. And if I need accommodation, this act basically kicks in. So it really doesn't just represent those with disabilities, it represents any and every individual should we have a situation where that need arises.
Okay, so here's the $1 million question. Does ADA apply to people with chronic or debilitating migraine, cluster, or other headache conditions? Because I think most of us assume these things don't apply to us because we sort of feel stigmatized a lot of the time, or that we've been told we can't take time off for a headache, quote. So does this apply to us?
The resounding answer is yes, it does. So okay. The Americans with Disabilities Act was actually amended to make clear that the act itself is not to focus on the medical reason why the person needs accommodation. The focus should be on whether or not the employer can accommodate the employee.
Okay. So let's walk through the process, because like I said, if someone in our audience, and I guarantee you there's plenty, need this and they need to understand it, they're in a lot of pain. So let's walk them through the process for someone who has chronic migraine, chronic cluster, or NDPH, etc. They've become sick enough that they feel they need to stop working for a period of time. What is the start of the process that they should be going through?
Well, I would recommend that the first step really is to talk to the employer about seeking FMLA. And we've talked about that in our previous episodes. So you get up to 12 weeks or 480 hours of time off. And let's just say now that the person has exhausted that time, but they still need to work. They still want to work and they want to retain their position. The next step would be for the employee to notify the employer that they feel that they have rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act for reasonable accommodation. And that begins a series of processes to to see whether the employer can accommodate the employee or not.
Okay. So FMLA, let's back up a little bit, usually lasts 12 weeks. Am I correct?
Right.
That's how much you get if you need the 12 weeks. You don't have to take all 12 weeks, but if you need it, it's there.
That's correct.
Okay. So can you get an extension for this under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act?
You can.
Okay.
There's a misunderstanding of a number of employers that FMLA is a steadfast rule of 12 weeks.
Okay.
It is not, because there's actually what's called the dovetail rule to the Americans with Disabilities Act, where, let's say, just for example, Lindsay, you're working in a position and you don't have chronic migraine, just for a second. You have some other malady.
Okay.
Where you need two or three more treatments before you can return to work.
Okay.
It would be reasonable to believe that an employer who's already had you off for 12 weeks could give you an extension for a few more weeks to get those additional treatments.
Okay.
So that same principle applies to someone with chronic migraine.
Okay.
You're able to function in the workplace, but periodically you have episodic conditions that require you to be off.
Okay.
The rest of the time you're there, you're available, you're able to work. And so it would be reasonable to suggest that an employer would need to accommodate you by giving you additional time off.
Okay. So I'm going to break for a minute because we're talking a lot about FMLA. So I want to make sure that everyone knows how to go learn about FMLA, because that is a ton of information. And it was in our last podcast and webcast. And the easiest way to find that is to go to the National Headache Foundation website, go under Heads Up Archives, and it is there. And if you have trouble finding it, there is a search function and you can type in FMLA. So that is the way to find that. And that is a lot of information. And if you are having this problem and you feel you can't work, I highly recommend going and finding that particular episode. So my next question is, we just discussed this extension, how the Americans with Disabilities Act may allow you to extend your FMLA. What sort of caveats come with this extension? Are there any caveats that go along with this?
So the biggest question is whether the employer can actually accommodate you.
Okay.
And let me give some examples.
Okay.
If it were, for example, you worked in retail during the holiday period, it might not be possible for your employer to extend your time off because 60% of the income of the business occurs between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So in a case like that, the employer might say that it would be a hardship to not be able to extend your time.
Okay.
But in most conditions, in most cases, it really is the onus or the responsibilities on the employer to show why they can't provide that accommodation, rather than on the employee. So that the focus has to be on the employer. Why can't they provide that accommodation? And that's why the law uses the term reasonable accommodation.
Okay. I was about to ask you what determines whether or not it's reasonable, but I think that you've pretty much answered that question, that it's dependent on the employer to pretty much explain why or why not they're able to do this, correct?
That's correct. And also something that has to be considered is the size and the fiscal resources of the employer. So a small employer, asking a small employer to provide, say, an adjustable desk, or to provide an individual with a stool, that would be considered reasonable. Where, if you were a large employer, it might be a more expensive accommodation that they'd be able to afford, let's say, putting in certain ramps or certain mechanical equipment that would assist the employee in doing their job. So it depends on the size of the employer. It depends on the cost. It depends on the season in which the accommodation is being requested. So there are a lot of different factors that exist in defining that reasonable accommodation. But the most important factor that we want to stress today to viewers and listeners is that the law says that it has to be an interactive process. So it is not simply the employee requesting accommodation, and the employer denying accommodation.
Okay.
An interactive process means that the employee and the employer have to work together to determine the best course of action.
Okay. All right. So like I said, I understand that if you are listening and you need this information, you're probably in a lot of pain. So let's walk people through the process. What forms need to be filled out? Is there a form? What do they need to do?
There really isn't a form per se
Okay.
to request reasonable accommodation.
Okay.
However, I always suggest that the employee put something in writing to the employer saying that here is my situation. For example, I need additional time off that I'm going to exceed the 12 weeks of time through FMLA. I need some additional time, and here's when and here's why. That would be an appropriate measure to begin the reasonable accommodation process for ADA, or just sending a letter to my supervisor or to the Human Resources Department requesting that we meet to talk about some accommodations that I need so that I can still perform my job to the best of my ability and still meet the conditions and demands of the employer with those accommodations in place.
Right. Okay. So let's tell people where they can go for more information so that they can start doing research if they need to. What is the website with the most accurate information?
Sure, probably the best website. It's a government-run website. It's from the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and it's at www.ada.gov. And that will give you a guide to disability rights and laws. And once again, there are so many different sites on the internet that provide information about ADA, but many of them are jaundiced. Many of them are run by law firms who may be patient advocates or may be employer advocates, and so you're never sure as to where that information, if it's the information that you really deserve to know. So I always recommend that the best place is to go to a government website, and not a state government website, but a federal government website, because it's the federal government that has to enforce the Americans with Disabilities Act, just as the federal government also enforces the Family Medical Leave Act.
I think where some of the confusion comes in for people, and I know this because I know that people with migraine and other chronic headache conditions are mostly trying to get through the day, just prove that they are able to keep up with their work. Using these accommodations is not something they ever wanted to do. So some of the confusion comes in with the word disability. So when we are using the protections afforded us by the Americans with Disabilities Act, some people don't understand that that might not necessarily mean that you are applying for disability. So can you tell us the difference between Social Security disability and utilizing the Americans with Disabilities Act? What is the difference there?
So the biggest difference is that the Americans with Disabilities Act is a law that's there. It's a tool to assist you while you remain in the workplace, while you remain actively employed. Social Security disability really is applying for benefits because you're unable to work.
Right.
So there's the biggest difference. ADA and FMLA apply to you while you're in the workplace, whereas at least as it relates to employment, SSDI, Social Security disability, applies when you can no longer be in the workplace.
Okay, so I just want to make that clear to everyone that that's why we're doing 3 episodes related to this. The first one was FMLA, second one, this one is ADA, and those apply for a leave you will need to take while you're in the workplace. And the next one we do will be SSDI for if you find yourself unable to go back. And we're going to discuss the process of applying for SSDI, which is applying for a disability. So is there anything else you'd like to add to today's conversation having to do with the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Again, keep in mind that it is an interactive process, and that's what the law says. So it's not simply you writing a letter to your employer and asking for accommodation and the employer deciding whether they can provide it or not.
Right.
What I would suggest is that you write a letter saying, I would like to begin the interactive process or a discussion
Mhm.
about what accommodations are available to me as an individual that needs some assistance. And that's what the law really protects employees for and on. And so my suggestion is know your rights, review the website that we've provided, and also be aware of the fact that this is a two-way street. It's not
Mhm.
just a one-sided process where the employer makes the determination solely without the employee.
As you were speaking, I came up with another question. Our previous episode on FMLA, we discussed that if it is your child or your spouse or someone that has the chronic headache condition and not you, and you're their caregiver, you can use FMLA to take care of them. If you need an extension after that, does the Americans with Disabilities Act provide an extension if you're the caregiver?
Generally, it would not.
Okay.
So it does provide, it provides for the employee, but not
Okay.
for someone around. Now, the ADA does have some protections against discrimination against a person who has to care for someone else with a disability. But in
Okay.
itself, it would not be able to be used for an extension of FMLA to care for your spouse or your parent or your child.
Okay, I assume so. I just wanted to ask that in case someone is in that situation. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today. And thank you everyone for listening in or watching our webcast. And please join us again next week for the weekly webcast and podcast of the National Headache Foundation. Goodbye, everyone.